What's up guys, JD from Candy Shop Customs here. It's another rainy spring day, June 2018 this time. We're going to do another lowering job on an old school truck. Today it's going to be a 78 Chevy half-ton. It's Jeremy's dad's truck, and him and his dad are doing a restoration project on this thing. His dad bought it brand new. Gorgeous truck. It's a burgundy and cream two-tone. Today what we're going to do is a set of springs and spindles up front. So 2-inch spring, 2.5-inch McGoy spindle. Out back we're going to do a flip kit, so that's going to drop at about 6 inches. We're going to pair that up with a set of Beltec Street Performance shocks. Okay, so this one should be pretty straightforward. I got Cash and Blue in the shop here, so you might see them chewing on stuff or walking around. And we're going to get going. So here's a little tip for you guys. If you're using a breaker bar and you don't have the swing to get exactly where you need to pull on that bolt, take the socket off, rotate it 1/4 of the square, and that's going to give you the next grab that you need so you can get another swing on that breaker bar. So because we're changing the spindles and the springs, we got to pull the rotor off, pull the caliper off. So what you want to do is the 2 caliper mounting bolts, pull those off, hang it out of the way, don't let it hang off the flex hose, that's bad. Check your flex hose for cracks and just say no to crack. So we'll pull the caliper, we'll pull the dust cap, there's a castle nut in here and the cotter pin, we'll take that off, and we'll take the rotor and bearings off as a one piece, and then before it goes back together on the new spindle, we'll clean and repack the bearings. Okay? So a little trick to getting the bearing out, once you have the castle nut off, just give it a pop, kicks the outer bearing off. To pull the inner bearing, if you want to take it out and repack it from the rotor, just thread the nut back on and then use the nut to pull the bearing and the seal, kind of like a slide hammer. Boom! Okay, so we got our calipers off. We got it suspended here in the corner with a bungee. We got our brake caliper bracket off the upper control arm. We got our dust shield off. So now we got our upper lower ball joints, and we have our tie rod that we need to split. So again, we got to pull that cotter pin off, and then we got to loosen these. So what we want to do, because this is under tension, we're going to pull a cotter pin. We're going to thread that down a couple threads so that we have a bit of clearance. And the ball joint is, the tie rod sits in a taper and it's wedged in itself. So what we know how to do is agitate it so that it'll pop loose. The ball joints, we're going to thread them down, leave them threaded on so that when we pop them loose, the spring pressure doesn't pop this thing out in your face. So what we're going to do is use the pressure to release the ball joints, and then we're going to support it with a jack stand and pull the springs off with control. Okay? So we've taken the cotter pin out, we've threaded it down almost all the way off, but still hooked up on a couple threads, and now we're going to use a swing press. So where we want to hit is just on the spindle. We don't want to hit the tie rod if the tie rod's still good. If you're just destroying it, it doesn't really matter, it's sacrificial. So we should be able to agitate this. There we go. And you can just push that out of the side. So we'll remove the cotter pins on the upper lower ball joints, but do not take the nuts off. Okay, so what we've done is we've loosened the castle nut, we've threaded it to the end of the thread, it's still grabbing on. The spring is still captured by the upper lower control arms, but it's got a ton of pressure on it. So you don't want to ever take that nut when you're releasing the pressure. So we're going to hit the spindle where it's nice and big and heavy, and the spring pressure should pop the upper and lower loose for us. There we go. Okay, so what we're going to do before we pull our spindles, and we use a floor jack to lower our control arm so we don't have that spring unleash all the pressure that it has all at once. We're going to do our sway bar from our control arm. So that's going to let the arm come down and we can actually control that spring energy as it's releasing. So we're going to buzz the mounts off and do that on both sides, and then the next thing is pulling the spindles. Okay, so we got our floor jack, we have our sway bar disconnected. I put a jack stand under the back of the truck so it doesn't get wiggly on the hoist. And what we're going to do is lift on that lower control arm, take that pressure off of the ball joint and the spindle so we can undo the nuts, and then we can actually pull our spindle off. So I want to do that in a controlled manner. If you think there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on the spring, you might want to chain the spring to the control arm as well. It's actually not bad practice to do. So let's see how this goes. So there we go, we got the tension off the spring, or off the ball joint, sorry. So we can actually undo the ball joint castle nuts. So there's our spindle. Now there's still a bunch of energy in this coil. So the idea of doing the release with the jack stand is that you're in control of it. Now I'm not too sure if we're going to have the reach to drop our arm to relieve all the tension off that coil. So we're going to stop and we're going to put chain on this thing. So we got all the tension loose. This thing's not going to jump out in our face, so we're good to undo our chain. Better safe than sorry, they say. There you go, spring is sprung. Okay guys, so we got our factory spring and then we got our 2-inch drop spring. Obviously it's shorter. Typically what they do as well to account for the shorter travel distance is they change the spring rate. So these are McGoy's 2-inch drop spring to go with a small block Chevy and a 78 Chevy C10. Good. Now, part 2 of our drop is courtesy of our drop spindle. So there's the factory spindle, and what you're looking at is from the ball joint to where the rotor or the wheel would actually sit. So that's the height there. And when we look at that in comparison to our 2-inch drop spindle here, you can see that that spindle, the center of it, is moved up that 2.5 inches. They've accounted for some steering geometry changes here for the tie rods to eliminate some bump steer. Should be a nice working piece. Cool? Okay guys, it's day number 2. We ran out of camera battery last night, kept working. So we have the lowering springs installed, the drop spindles installed. So just to kind of give you a heads up what you need to be aware of when the spring goes back in. New spring is shorter than the old one, so that's a little easier going in. You don't have so much spring pressure to deal with. But there is a shape to the top coil. So it's kind of like a D opening. And inside the spring pocket in the frame where the spring sits, there's also a mount that is a D shape. So you got to line up that shape to the upper mount. Ideally, the lower coil should sit in one spot in the control arm where the end of the coil would be. Doesn't quite line up with the new drop springs. So because the upper mount only goes in one way, that's what I chose to line up properly. That's what I did. It's that way on both sides. I used a floor jack just to lift up on the bottom control arm once I got the spindle in, bring that up to the upper, and we put new cotter pins on upper lower ball joint and our tie rod. We spent a bit of time cleaning up just with a wire wheel and gave it a fresh coat of satin black just because it cleans it up a little bit. So that's in, all tight. The control arm bushings, upper 2 nuts and the lower 2 nuts, we all cracked that loose. New shock is installed and we left those bushings loose because what we need to do is we need to have weight on the suspension before we tighten those bushings. So if you watch the F100 or F150 lowering job, the bushing is torso elastic. So the center of the bushing is bonded to a sleeve and the outer mount of that shock is bonded to that rubber. So the center is isolated with rubber on either one. And it needs to be able to twist up and down. So because we've just lowered where the weight of the suspension is going to mount the position the control arms, we need to crack those loose so that center sleeve can reorientate itself with weight on it where it's now going to live, which is different than before, and then that's where we got to retighten those up. So remember to do that with weight on the suspension and you should be good to go. Okay, so with this apart, we have already cleaned out the wheel bearings. So just to show you guys a little tip, I'm going to show you a little bit of a repack. So I'm going to take a little bit of grease. So I'm going to take palm of grease like that and going to take our wheel bearings. So these have already been packed and cleaned. What you want to do is clean them in some solvent, get all the old grease out of there and dry them. So basically you're going to make like a cup kind of with your hand and you're going to kind of take a little kind of scoop with that front edge of the bearing and then you're just kind of starting to work it in there. And what you'll see is happening is, come on, focus, focus. Well, you can kind of see it. Right there, you can start to see little kind of scoops of grease starting to walk their way through the rollers. So you want to do that all the way around the bearing and then you know you have grease all the way through this thing. Use a decent quality grease. It is part of regular maintenance. Do that to the inner and the outer. The brake rotor itself, you want to have the old grease wiped out of it and you want to take some grease, which is what we just used for the bearing, and we want to coat the bearing races and the space between the bearing races inside the hub. So we don't need a huge amount, doesn't need to be packed solid. We just want to coat those surfaces with a small amount so that it's going to prevent any moisture buildup and corrosion happening inside that. Cool. So there's our grease. I've already kind of coated on the inside of that, coated the bearing race. We want to take our freshly packed wheel bearing. There's the outer one, and that pops down into position. You can give it a little bit more if you want. And that's kind of that. Now, the wheel seal is going to have to go in position. So depending on what you have at your disposal, I like to use a 2x4. The wheel seal goes in place. Use a chunk of 2x4, put that on there. And then you just install that flush with the hub. You can hear the noise change when it's seated all the way, and that's ready to go. So we did that same amount of grease on the outside, so this bad boy is ready to go on the truck. Okay, so we got our brake rotor, outer bearing is already in there, new wheel seal is in place. It's ready to go on the spindle. Make sure that sits flat. We're going to take our outer bearing, and that's going to go in there. Just going to give that excess grease a little wipe into the little pocket. Washer goes in place, that sits flat. And we're going to take the castle nut. So castle nut's going to go on, and we need to seat these bearings. So we need to get them squared up in place. I have a wrench. You can use a crescent wrench. So spin that rotor and tighten the bearing. Put a bit of preload. It's tight. I like to roll that to get that bearing seated. Now, you don't want preload. Preload is pressure on the bearings. The way wheel bearings work is that they run a clearance as they warm up. It takes up that clearance and puts a proper amount of preload. The grease is very viscous, very thick. So that's what supports the load. You don't ever want pressure on the bearings, because then it's going to, when it heats up, it's going to have too much pressure and you're going to have bearing failure. So typically what we do is we seat them with a bit of preload, then we back them off to take all the clearance. So that's zero preload. You see how freely it actually spins. And then typically from that zero preload, we usually go back about 1 notch. 1 notch, there's going to be small amount of play, but that's going to be ensuring that you have long bearing life. You can take a fresh cotter pin, that's going to go in there, and bend that over. Don't ever use a cotter pin more than once. You took a cotter pin off, you're putting a brand new cotter pin on. So bend that in there, good to go. Okay, so there's our dust cap. I just cleaned it up with some Scotch-Brite SOS pad, degreased it and gave it a fresh coat of satin black. So that's going to go in there. Some people just take a hammer and they'll just bang on the end of this thing. I got a little different of a method. What I've done is take an old bearing race, and that's going to sit on that little flange, and I can kind of roll that. And then keep kind of rolling it, tapping it till it's nice and square. That way the cap's not all dented in, it's not all mangled, looks nice and pretty. And when you're done, you should have a nice free rotating brake rotor. So that's that. Next thing we got to do is we're going to get ready to put our brake caliper back on. Because this is a brand new spindle, we want to lubricate the contact points. So the contact points on the spindle are where the caliper sits. So 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top. Machine surface here, typically I put a bit of anti-seize. There's that. Same thing on the caliper. I've already filed the excess rust off the moving the contact area here on the caliper, so it's nice and clean. There's that. Sit that on the control arm, it's not hanging. Okay. There's our outer pad. That sits in there. For the inner pad, this is our outer pad. And that's going to go and we're going to sit that back into position. Now on the caliper, there's two spots that we want to lubricate. And that's going to be these pins. The two end pieces have a small rubber seal in the calipers on either side. And then there's a bushing on the inside. Again, there's a seal. So what I use for lubrication, remember kids, lube is important. I just have these little packets of GM silicone brake lube. So a little bit of that, get those in the O-rings, and then you can install your pins and your bushings, and then you can bolt up your caliper tight. Okay? For the small end, you can take a small screwdriver, put a little bit of that silicone lube in there, and just put that in the bushing ends. And gets enough on those on the inside. Small amount on these pins. And then that just slides inside those rubber grommets or seals inside the caliper. Rubber bushings, I guess. And that goes in there. Pins get the same treatment on the end. So there's our pin. A little bit of lube on the end of the pin. Goes in there. There's that. Wipe off that excess. There you go, rotor's on, caliper's on, caliper slides, contact points are all serviced. It's ready to go. Front's ready for a wheel to go back on.